Hello, and welcome to the British Columbia Museums Association webinar. My name is Anissa Paulson, and I will be your host for today. This is a recording of our webinar topic, Archives Take Action, Taking Steps to Respond to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission Calls for Action for Provincial and Community Archives. The webinar is presented by Genevieve Weber, who is an archivist at the Royal BC Museum and BC Archives. Unfortunately, at the live recording of this presentation back in March 2019, we experienced some technical difficulties. As a result, the first few minutes of Genevieve's presentation are clipped. We apologize for the inconvenience, but know that you will still find the majority of the webinar content intact and highly informative.
And those can come from families or individuals, companies, organizations, any records group that fits our mandate of collecting records of provincial significance are records that we would consider acquiring into our collections. Now, I know some of this, a lot of you know a lot about museums and archives, so this is a little bit of an overview of things that you probably already know, but I'm going to start with my little pop quiz. If you were all here in person, I would make you put up your hands and answer the question. A record in our collections is any recorded information. So in terms of format, that can come in so many different ways. Textual records, here's a nice image of boxes on a shelf, and that's generally what we see when we think about textual records and the inside of a file. All of these records that I'm going to show you, we as a government repository and a provincial repository, we keep records in all these formats about Indigenous communities. So the majority of the records that we have in our collections relating to Indigenous communities were created by non-Indigenous people about Indigenous people, although we do have some instances where we have the direct voice or writing of an Indigenous community as well, which I'll touch on a little bit. But a lot of the records that we have, there's a lot of information about Indigenous people, and that can be tricky in terms of access. People feel very, and rightfully so, uncomfortable often coming to us as a colonial institution, very embedded in these colonial practices, and still in a lot of ways embedded in what we would consider traditionally colonial practices. So how do we change that as we look for the information in these records? Maps. We have lots of maps. This example here is a hand-drawn map. So a cartographic record can be a map, an architectural drawing, a sketch. So a lot of our maps are things that people today wouldn't consider a map. When you think of street maps or Google Maps, these maps are incredibly useful. They often have information that you wouldn't see on most modern maps. So information about plants, hunting and fishing sites, houses. You often see sketches of all the buildings that were in a certain location. This particular map that I'm showing you is from the records of the Joint Indian Reserve Commission, which started in the 1870s after BC joined Confederation. This commission was really designed to formally establish the reserve system that we know today. It was followed up with the McKenna-McBride Commission. And these maps and the records related to them are one of the collections that we get a lot of Indigenous users asking to see and access. Sound recordings. Sound recordings come on tape reels. They might be on cassettes, or they might be on CD or digital. Sound recordings could be a radio show. They might be a government broadcast, or they might be from our oral history collection. So we have a significant number of recordings in our oral history collection. The oral history program in the archives was conducted in the 70s and 80s, where staff would interview people from around the province, asking them about their lives and their history, and they interviewed a large number of Indigenous people during that period. So some really great information there. And I'll talk a little bit more about sound recordings shortly. Moving picture recordings, moving picture records are what we might call films or videos. And again, those could be government records or private records, private being anything that's non-government. Lots of interesting material in that. and photographs. We have about 180,000 digitized photographs, which is great. Those are all accessible online, very easy to get to, but we have over 5 million in total. So lots of images that we have not been able to digitize and make available online, but lots that you can come in and see on site if you're able to, or order from a distance. And I'll talk a little bit about how to access material if you're not able to actually come down to Victoria. In addition to that primary source material, we also have other material that is considered complementary to that. So we have a PDP collection that stands for paintings, drawings, and prints. And we have a lot of, a lot of great records in that collection. And we have a library collection. It's a non-circulating library collection, but it has a lot of really useful, what we like to call gray material. So material that's not truly published material, but it's also not archival material. So things like, in other words, not primary source, things like pamphlets or brochures that would have had multiple prints made, but were not published in the way a book is. And that material can be really great, a really great resource to go along with the archival research that you're doing. And of course, lots of newspapers on site as well that can help with your research. So in terms of the material that we have relating to Indigenous peoples, we have some guides that we have created and make available online that talk about specifically some of the resources that First Nations communities and researchers use when they come in to the archives. We have a number of other guides as well, but I wanted to show you the ones that we have dedicated specifically to First Nations research. The Fort Victoria treaties that you see listed on there are also known as the Douglas Treaties or Vancouver Island Treaties, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. These guides are really helpful. You can download them to your computer, and they have a lot of call numbers and other resources beyond the BC archives as well that you might find useful. So I don't expect you to read all the small print, but the TRC final report and calls to action included specific calls that were directed at museums and archives. The ones related to archives are really directed at Library and Archives Canada. However, there's some simple aspects to it that we have taken on ourselves. And we've sort of translated those to the BC archives and made sure that we're responding to those specific calls as well. And then in addition to responding to those specific calls, we have identified as a larger organization 3 thematic areas that we feel are really important ways that we can respond to the calls to action as a whole. So broadly speaking, education, language, and cultural engagement are the sort of high-level ways that we're looking at responding. So some of the specific things that we're doing, again, I realize that this is one of those slides with lots of print on it, so I apologize, but I'm going to talk a little bit about most of these, and I've got slides to follow that focus on them. If there's anything that I skip that you see on the slide that you're really curious about, please feel free to ask in the question period. I did cut out quite a few slides from the last time I did a similar presentation to make sure that I was within my time limit. So I'm happy to answer lots of questions at the end though. Language revitalization support is really important, especially in this year that we're recognizing the UNESCO Year of Indigenous Language, and there's a lot of ways that we can do that. So particularly in our sound recording collections, there's a lot of recordings of Indigenous languages and, excuse me, and Indigenous songs. And in working with Indigenous language speakers, I hear again and again people talking about how learning the songs, learning the ceremonies is a wonderful way that they learn their language, and how supportive having those materials available can be. So we do have a number of sound recordings of Indigenous song and ceremony, and we're working with the communities that they came from to make sure that we can have digital copies returned back to those communities, recognizing that it's such an important part of cultural and language revitalization work happening in those communities. I'm going to sort of skip through some of these as I have slides on them. and I'll be talking a lot more about most of these in the following slides. But the one thing that I don't have a slide about, second to the bottom, waiving fees for reproductions of Indigenous cultural heritage. At the moment, if Indigenous researchers are asking for reproductions of material that relate to their cultural heritage, we don't charge a fee for accessing reproductions of those. So I'm just going to stop for a quick drink of water. But the first thing I'm going to talk about is this UNESCO submission that we put forward and were accepted to last year. So UNESCO recently, it has a Memory of the World program, and this is designed to recognize documentary heritage from around the world that is significant and important to the greater global population. But UNESCO Canada started its own national register last year, and we were really pleased to have 2 collections added to that register. Having them added to the register, it sounds like maybe it's something that is a nice honor to have, but it does a lot more than that, because it really highlights these collections and their significance and ensures that there's pressure on us to make sure that we really continue to work on preserving and making accessible these records. So it was important to me in the work that I do that these particular collections were recognized. Part of what we had to do in order to have them added to the register was to do a lot of consultation work. I'm still working with the descendants of the Ida Halpern records. I haven't been able to reach all of them. Consultation work is something that takes many years, and I'm very, very lucky that we have administration here at the Museum and Archives that recognize that this is not a project that can be done in a matter of months or even 1 or 2 years, but it's something that has to be ongoing. So the consultation process that we started with the working particularly with the descendants of the singers who were in the Ida Halpern recordings, we're continuing that for the foreseeable future. The Ida Halpern recordings, sorry, I got a bit ahead of myself. Ida Halpern was an ethnomusicologist who came to Canada in the 40s and began working with Indigenous communities in the late 40s to record ceremonies and songs at a time when a lot of the community leaders were realizing that there was a generation gap taking place where they didn't have people in the younger generation to pass on this knowledge to, for a number of reasons, partially because the younger generations were going to residential schools and they weren't there, and also because they didn't speak the language because of residential schools. So there was a moment where the community leaders were realizing we should make a recording of these songs so that future generations can learn these songs and carry on the traditions. So a really, really important collection. There's quite a few hundred songs in it, and we've been working with the descendants of these singers to make sure that we get copies of the songs back into the community, as well as other material from the collection. So she made copious notes as she met with each singer about the singer, about the songs. She transcribed them, as you can see on the screen. So lots of material that's very, very important for language and cultural revitalization. The Vancouver Island Treaties, also known as the Douglas Treaties, are really important in British Columbia history and specifically in Vancouver Island history. The treaties were made between the Hudson's Bay Company chief factor James Douglas before he became the governor, and the local First Nations communities. Most of the treaties were between communities on the South Island, and there's also some with communities on the North Island. The treaties, they recognize Indigenous title to the land. They set out an agreement regarding that land. And importantly, in modern times, they safeguard the Indigenous communities' rights to hunt and fish as they had prior to the signing of the treaties. These treaties are regularly used in courts of law in this part of the province to prove those rights. So they're very important to the communities here. And although a lot of those communities do not recognize that these treaties were willingly signed into, they do access them and require them on a regular basis in terms of them being ratified in court. They're very important. Recently, we were very lucky to be gifted with 3 translations of 3 of the treaties, 2 by Dr. Elmer George into Lekwungen. So he translated 2 of the treaties relating to the land that he's from into his language, and that's what you can see on the left side of the screen, and 1 by Dr. John Elliott into Senchothan, which is the Wasanish language. He did something really interesting where he found that it was very difficult to translate the treaty into his language because there were so many concepts and words that just simply didn't translate. So what he ended up doing was working with other language speakers. They reimagined how the treaty would have taken place. The treaties actually took place orally on top of a mountain here in Victoria, and where they could see the land for quite a far distance. And he reimagined how that conversation would have happened from the perspective of his ancestors. Once he did that, he then retranslated it back into English. So again, for language work, this is really essential. It's also really important because we now can compare the original to this new translation in the Wasanish language into Senchothan. And having them side by side is so useful for researchers and for students. So we keep the translations in the same box as the reproductions of the originals that we make accessible to people in the reference room. And I know that for myself, I've been using them with school programs that have come through, and it's been very successful. So this is the description, part of the description that we have online of the Ida Halpern records that I was mentioning. And I'm going to use this to segue into something else that we've been working on, which is thinking more about the way that we describe our records and indigenizing our records descriptions to make them to use the language better, but also to describe them in a way that better fits how our collaborators, when we work with community members, if they tell us we wouldn't describe something that way, we're trying to shift the way we talk. Now, of course, any of you who work in archives know that the national standard for describing archival records can be quite prescriptive and doesn't allow a lot of wiggle room. So we've been working within that structure at the moment, but hoping to change that to some degree. So what you can see here is the title proper is the title that Ida Halpern gave this particular item when she was working on these records, but the parallel title includes the name that my predecessor who worked here before, he was able to hire Kwakwaka'wakw speakers who worked with him, and they listened to recordings and they were able to provide the title that was actually spoken by the singer in the recordings. And we were also able to incorporate the diacritics for the Kwakwaka'wakw language into the title as well. And I've had a lot of feedback from community members who have found this really helpful because there's a number of songs called potlatch song, for example. Even Hug Miskin, which is what her Ida Halpern's translation of it was. There's many songs that are described that way, but this way, having this extra information allows the community members to pick the song that they're actually looking for their purposes, which has been really helpful. This is another example. There's so many songs titled Hamatsa song, but having the extra information adds a lot of meaning to that record and allows better access to that record by the community members. We don't have the songs actually on the database because some of these songs have cultural and family restrictions on them. And that's something else that we've been working with the communities to determine. I'm hoping to meet with some of the descendants of one of the singers soon. We've been working on that for some time, and we'll work on going through the songs to determine, are these songs that everybody can listen to? Are they songs that certain people in the community can listen to, or are these songs restricted and should be kept private? At the moment, we are approach is to make information about each song available, but then wait until we hear from the community to know whether we can actually share that song or not. This is another example from that. Something else we're doing is more Indigenous focused programming. So we have over time ebbed and flowed in terms of how much programming we do in the archives, depending on staffing and all kinds of other things. But one of the things that we're doing, we often have workshops and programming, and we are trying to do more programming that is really focused on Indigenous research. So this photo is from an Indigenous genealogy workshop that we did in partnership with Library and Archives Canada and the Greater Victoria Public Library. It was really successful, a really great workshop where we were able to demonstrate to users both how to do research in our archives, but also in the Vancouver branch of the Library and Archives Canada offices there, and the specific material that they have, and how we can really work together. It was a really great experience. It was a great experience for me because I got to learn so much about my colleagues' work at Library and Archives Canada, and meet a lot of Indigenous researchers from mostly from the island. They had done one with Vancouver Public Library on the mainland as well. The link that I have at the bottom is a documentary that we made. It's about 11 minutes long. And this photo, the documentary was made with Dr. Evan Adams, and it's about doing genealogy research in the archives. And when I showed it at the workshop, I love this photo because this woman at the end, her husband actually said to me that this is Dr. Evan Adams' sister. And he apparently hadn't even told his family that he made a video with us. So that was a lot of fun. And there's so many of these connections that are made as we do this programming with communities. It's so wonderful. Another way that in a sort of broader way that we're doing consultation and engagement is at multinational events. So this is at the Elders Gathering last year. The Elders Gathering is this wonderful event that happens every year where it's very celebratory. Elders from all over the province come together in one place to celebrate, dance, share stories, grieve. They come together. They have spaces for everything. It's usually over a few days. In addition, they have vendors and that are set out that you can browse. And we had a table with my colleagues from the Indigenous department in the museum where we displayed resources and were able to meet with people from all over the province to talk about how they can access our collections, how they can do research, how they can access from a distance, which I thought I would mention. So maybe now is a good time to talk about that. So if people are not able to come into the archives, a lot of our resources they can access from afar. So we have on our database, you can read descriptions of most of the records. If we have digitized those records, we do have them up online if we're able to. So there's quite a few photographs. There's also examples of maps and textual records that we've managed to put up online. If they're not online though, that doesn't mean you can't access them. You can email us to ask for copies, or you can also order copies through an online order form that we have. And like I said, for Indigenous researchers, the fees are waived for the reproduction costs. So please do pass that on. At this, obviously in these photos here, I got to eat really good seafood, which was great. I apologize if you aren't into crustaceans, but they were really, really tasty. So, you know, a benefit, I really love my job, and a benefit is that I get to go to these places and meet these wonderful people and eat delicious food, which is great. We do a lot of consultation and engagement in the reference room. So when we have groups come, often Indigenous researchers very often come in large groups, and that there's been times in the past where the archives has found that challenging because we're really set up for individual researchers. That's sort of how our system works, and I think a lot of archives are like that. And that's, again, a very European way of approaching research. that doesn't work for a lot of Indigenous communities. We actually have a large group in right now from near Merritt, and they come down, and some of these groups come down every year. They come down to Victoria, and they come in large groups of people. So what we try and do is generally it ends up being me or maybe another archivist, but we do try, if we know that they're coming, we'll dedicate an archivist time to working one-on-one with them for at least part of the time that they're here. So if they let us know ahead of time what their research interests are, we'll make sure to have that material ready for them. You can see that the way they're gathered around the table, that is, normally we have rules about people have to sit on the other side for security reasons, but having an archivist with them gives them a lot more freedom to move around as they like, look at the material, handle the material in a way that maybe we would be a little more strict about. We really want to relax those rules as much as possible and accommodate groups coming in to do research together. These folks were former students from the Incomeep Day School in the Okanagan, and we were able to pull a lot of material, and it was such a wonderful experience. We had a great couple days with them. In addition to looking at the material from the school, we were able to find other material relating to that family. How am I doing for time? Yeah. So we were able to pull other material, and the man whose back is to us with the hat on, he was able to hear a sound recording of his father. It was the first time he'd heard his voice in 40 years, and it was really, really wonderful. He was a bit hard of hearing, so he put the headphones on and then started shouting across the room, "I can hear his voice." It was great. So lots of really fun and touching experiences when groups come into the reference room. This is an example of some of the records that I got out for that group that day. Anthony Walsh was a teacher at the Incomeep School. So not every group can come to us. So again, I've been very fortunate that I had the support of my supervisors in that in traveling out to communities. So far it's tended to be that if I'm going traveling for work somewhere anyway, then I will take some extra time and contact the communities that are close to where I'm traveling and find out if they're interested in having me come out and talk to them about the archives. So far, it's always been a yes. And what I'll do ahead of time is I prepare an intro to using the archives, a little more detailed than what I gave today. And then I'll also do research ahead of time to identify records relating to that community. And I recently went to the Okanagan, and the next couple of slides are some examples of the types of things that I prepare for those communities when I'm heading out to visit them. And I don't know if it's just luck, but I always end up stumbling upon something where someone in the audience member says, "That's my mother," or "That's my grandmother." And that happened with this sound recording, which is great. So we were able to get that person copies of this recording after my presentation, which was really great. So again, these are examples too of different types of records that people might not think to look in for records about their family or their community. So in the Webster collection, for example, Webster was a television show, a talk show, and he tended to talk to about politics. So he talked to activists and politicians. He also talked about popular culture. So there's a lot of different information in there. And this particular one, there's some great interviews with chiefs from that region. So again, thinking outside the box in terms of where there might be material inside our collections that people are interested in and want to access. And then contacting, so we're trying to be proactive in terms of contacting communities to let them know, I'm not sure if you're aware, but we have a lot of material from your community and we'd love to talk to you about how to access that. Another record that I've been working with lately is connected to the Ktunaxa Nation, and it's a record in a government record series that had been poorly identified, so I think a lot of researchers wouldn't have known what the contents actually were. I was part of the Attorney General document series, and it was all about what was then described as the Kootenay Uprising, which was an incident that took place in the Ktunaxa region. And I don't have time to get into the details of the file right now. It's about 280 pages long. It is on our database, so search for Ktunaxa and you will be able to find it and read the document itself. But I've been working with the Ktunaxa Nation to talk to them about what is the importance of this record, how can we make sure that we're providing access to it in a safe and appropriate way, and also what would they like us to do in terms of making sure word gets out there about the information that's in this record. So I was invited to go to the Ktunaxa Nation Council Annual General Assembly this year, which was a really great experience, and I was invited to attend their annual powwow, which was really wonderful as well, and to witness some of the ceremonies and events that took place at that powwow. So really getting out and traveling. Oh, I don't know why it's not moving now. There we go. Oh, I apologize for those words sticking through. I don't know what happened there. But this is the last image I'm going to end with, because this little girl was such a lovely, enthusiastic jingle dancer. She was such a joy to watch. It was one of my favorite parts of being at the powwow. So I guess in summary, the thing that we're really trying to do more, and that we find is the most successful in terms of engaging with communities, is trying to proactively reach out to communities. We've been very reactive in the past, waiting for communities to come to us and to say, we want to come and do research, or we think we need your help with something. So we're trying to be more proactive and get out there more often, go to the communities to ease that burden of travel from those communities. And make sure that we really reach out and find out what the people in the communities actually want from us, and what their needs are. So here's some details, and I think that's me. So if anybody has any questions, I would love to answer them.
We have 10 minutes left now, so feel free to type your chat into the chat box, and we can share that with Genevieve. I have a question for you, actually, and that is, what are some ways for small community museums and archives to tailor some of these ideas to their situations when they're faced with limited resources?
That's a great question, and I realize that resources are tight everywhere. I think the great benefit to smaller organizations is that, the question was, I'm being asked to repeat the question, what are ways for small community museums and archives to tailor some of these ideas to their institutions when they have limited resources? So I think that one of the benefits to being in a smaller organization is that your geographic area is hopefully smaller than what we deal with the BC Archives. So hopefully contacting the communities that are represented in your collections will be a little bit easier, because they'll be closer to you geographically. And I guess one of my tips is to really be open in terms of what you do. So don't go to a community and say, we have this stuff, here's what we'd like to do. I find that it's often communities are really strapped for time and resources themselves, and they may have a great interest in working with a local museum or archives, but don't necessarily have resources themselves, or they might have an idea of what they really want to do, but haven't had the time or wherewithal to bring it up with you. So if you approach a community, frame it as, we have material about your community, we'd really like to work with you. And then if they say, well, that sounds great, we don't know what we'd like to do, then come up with some ideas, but let them lead the collaboration if at all possible. And also don't be afraid to make that first call. So in the BC Archives, we're a government organization, so we tend to take a nation-to-nation approach. So if we are contacting a nation that we have not had previous contact with, so we don't have a history of working with them, then we tend to go to the government. So if I'm contacting them, then I'll go to a tribal council or band council, and I'll find the cultural representative if they have somebody who does that kind of work, or language representative, traditional knowledge, a staff person, and I'll contact that person. If my boss is contacting somebody, then they'll go higher and go to a director or somebody like that, and tend to make contact that way. If we have, even when we've contacted communities where we know that we're looking for a specific family, we tend to go that route and have them put us in touch with the right people. Do we have any formal MOU with these communities, or perhaps an advisory group that meets regularly with representatives from communities? Yes, that's a great question. So the work that I've been doing, we have not yet established any formal MOU with them, but the Museum and Archives does establish memorandums of understanding with communities regularly. So I've been working with communities. We just haven't got to that point yet in the work that we've been doing, but we hope to. My colleagues in the Greater Museum, there's many examples of times. So if before I approach a community, I check with my museum colleagues, because the Museum and Archives were separate organizations until 2003, we're often not aware of previous work that took place in the museum. So I make sure to contact the Indigenous department and find out, have you worked with this community before? What was your history? Do you have an MOU? To make sure that I'm not skirting around any protocols. So yes, in theory, I guess the short answer is sometimes we do, and in theory that's a goal. We do want to have formal MOUs, but again, it also sort of depends on, it's a community by community basis. We sort of see what they feel most comfortable with.
Are there any other
sorry. The advisory group, I didn't answer that part. The museum has an Indigenous advisory board, and that was established fairly recently. So at the moment, the work that I've done has not gone through the advisory board, but again, once it gets to a level where it's maybe being broadly circulated, then we would go through the advisory board. And we hope that the advisory board will be able to give us some guidance on future ways of approaching this. It's all fairly new for us. In the last couple of years, I guess we had a fairly big shift in the way that the museum has done a lot of this work for a long time, but because the museum established, they formed an Indigenous department from staff that already existed that brought them together to work in one department, and then created the advisory board. So it's fairly new in terms of the way it actually affects our work. Are there any other questions? Oh, now we can't see the chat.
Again, feel free to type your question into the chat if you have one. Okay.
Oh, and I didn't answer the last part of the question. Are the memorandum of understanding shared with other organizations? That's a good question, because I haven't been directly involved in signing those memorandums yet. I don't know, but I suspect they could be, and I could follow up on that. I'll follow up with my colleagues about that.
Okay, well,
Okay,
thank
you very much again,
Genevieve, for sharing your experiences at the BC Archives. We really appreciate it. Hopefully, people listening have taken away some moments of inspiration and some ideas to apply into their communities as well. So as part of our thank you, the BC Museums Association's thank you to Genevieve, we will be sending her her very own BCMA mug. I will actually be just handing it over to her because she's sitting with me here in our office today. So.
Hooray. Thank you so much.
Again, thank you all for joining us today, and we would like to invite you to join us in April. On Tuesday, April 9th, we will be hosting a webinar on top tips for effective volunteer programs, presented by Tracy Gibson from Volunteer Victoria. And if you do have any suggestions or expertise that you would like to share through this format, just feel free to email us and send us your idea. Later today, you will be receiving a link to fill out our follow-up survey. So we would love to hear how you felt about this webinar, and again, another opportunity to share ideas for future webinars with us. And lastly, if you're not already a member of the BCMA, just consider joining us and staying connected. Thank you, everybody, and we'll hopefully see you in April. Bye-bye.